The fabric was soft between my fingers, a deep crimson brushed cotton that felt like warmth itself. I held up the small set, the tiny reindeer prancing across the chest in a silent, joyful parade. It was perfect, absolutely perfect. I had spent weeks searching for these pajamas, not just any pajamas, but the right ones. They could not be too loud or too childish or too cheap. They had to be just so. A symbol. That is what they were, really. A symbol of us, the Miller family, united and cozy and whole on Christmas morning. I pictured it as I stood in the brightly lit department store, the air thick with the cloying scent of cinnamon and pine from a nearby display. Marcus, my serious, wonderful son, relaxing for once, his arm around Chloe. My granddaughter, Lily, a whirlwind of 4-year-old energy, tearing open a present while wearing her little matching set. And me, Lorraine, the architect of this perfect scene, my heart so full it could burst. I placed the set for Lily back into the cart, on top of the larger ones for Marcus and Chloe and my own. The cart was a testament to my hope. It was not just the pajamas. There was the specific brand of eggnog Marcus had loved since he was a boy, the one with the nutmeg already grated on top. There was the expensive wrapping paper, thick and glossy, because presentation matters. It is the wrapping that builds the anticipation, that shows you care enough to make something beautiful. A memory, sharp and sweet, pierced through my planning. A Christmas from years ago, when Marcus could not have been more than 10. The living room was a hurricane of torn paper and discarded ribbons. My husband, Robert, was trying to assemble a bicycle with instructions that were clearly written in another language, muttering curses under his breath while Marcus bounced around him, desperate to ride. The turkey was probably drying out in the oven, and I had spilled flour all down my front while making the pie crust. It was chaos, beautiful, loving chaos. The air was filled with laughter, with shouts, with the sheer, uncontainable energy of a family truly together. There was no quiet then. There was only life. Robert has been gone 5 years now, and the silence he left behind is a presence all its own. But back then, the noise was our symphony. That memory faded, replaced by the more recent ones, the ones that had prompted this entire, elaborate campaign for perfection. The quiet tension that had settled over our family gatherings since Marcus married Chloe. It was not anything you could point to, not a single, dramatic event. It was a chill, a gradual cooling of the atmosphere. Conversations that once flowed easily now hit invisible walls. Jokes that Marcus and I used to share would land and then die, unanswered, as if they were spoken in a foreign language Chloe refused to learn. She was not rude, not exactly. She was polished, impenetrable. Her compliments were always perfectly measured, her smiles never quite reaching her eyes. Our home, which had once been Marcus's sanctuary, now felt like a place he visited, a museum of his former life. But Christmas, I thought, as I pushed my cart toward the checkout, Christmas could change that. The spirit of the season could melt any frost. This pre-Christmas dinner I was heading to now was the first step. A soft launch of the holiday cheer. I had suggested it, of course. Chloe had agreed with that smooth, agreeable tone she uses that somehow still feels like a refusal. That would be lovely, Lorraine. But her voice had been as flat as still water. The drive to their house was a journey through a landscape of twinkling lights. Every house seemed to be trying to outshine the next, a riot of inflatable Santas and glowing reindeer. I used to love that. Now, the displays felt a little desperate, like they were trying to shout down the darkness. I clutched the steering wheel, the beautifully wrapped box containing the pajamas sitting on the passenger seat beside me. It was my peace offering, my flag of truce. I pulled into their driveway. Their house was a modern masterpiece of glass and pale stone, so different from the warm, cluttered brick home where I had raised Marcus. Every shrub was perfectly shaped, not a single leaf dared to litter the immaculate lawn. It looked like a magazine spread, not a place where people lived and loved and made messes. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my dress before grabbing the gift and the bag with the eggnog. Chloe answered the door. She was, as always, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored sweater and dark slacks, her blonde hair a perfect swing. "Lorraine, you are right on time." She stepped back to let me in. The house was warm, but the warmth did not seem to penetrate the sterile cleanliness of the entryway. Everything was in its place. There were no stray shoes, no coats tossed over a chair. It was beautiful, and it was utterly lifeless. "Marcus is just finishing up in the kitchen," she said, leading me into the living room. The tree was there, a tall, slender spruce decorated in a monochromatic scheme of silver and white. It was elegant. It was also completely joyless. There were no clumsy, handmade ornaments from a child's past, no garlands of popcorn, no tinsel thrown on with wild abandon. It was a tree that had been styled, not decorated. Marcus came in, wiping his hands on a towel. A genuine smile broke across his face when he saw me. "Mom, you made it!" He hugged me, and for a moment everything felt normal. He still smelled the same, like soap and warmth. "Something smells amazing," I said, holding out the bag. "I brought the eggnog, the kind you like." "You did not have to do that," Chloe said, taking the bag from me as if it were a specimen. She placed it on the counter, away from the other, more sophisticated-looking ingredients she had laid out. "It is no trouble," I said, my voice a little too bright. "It would not be Christmas without it." We sat down to dinner. The table was set with minimalist china, each piece precisely spaced. The conversation was stilted, skimming the surface of safe topics. Work was fine. The weather was seasonal. Lily, thank God for Lily, chattered about her preschool's Christmas play. She was the only splash of color in the room, a bright, beautiful mess. This was the moment. I could feel it. The food was finished, a perfectly cooked but somehow soulless meal. The time was right. My heart began to beat a little faster, a flutter of anticipation mixed with a deep, primal fear. This was the cornerstone of my plan. "I have a little something," I said, my voice trembling slightly as I reached for the box. "A pre-Christmas gift for all of you." Marcus smiled, a warm, curious smile. "Mom, you should not have." "It is nothing much," I said, though it was everything. "Just a silly tradition I wanted to start." I handed the box to Chloe, as she was the gatekeeper. She took it with careful hands, her expression unreadable. She untied the ribbon with slow, deliberate movements, folded the paper neatly instead of tearing it. She lifted the lid and pushed aside the tissue paper. She looked at the pajamas. She did not touch them, her face did not soften, it hardened. "Lorraine," she said, and her voice was like ice cracking on a pond. The room went quiet. Even Lily seemed to sense the shift and stopped fidgeting. "This is thoughtful." I leaned forward, my hope a fragile bird in my chest. "I thought we could all wear them on Christmas morning. When you come over, it would be so fun, would it not? A family picture." Chloe's eyes met mine. There was no warmth in them, no flicker of understanding. There was only a cold, final dismissal. She closed the box lid with a soft, definitive click. "It is a lovely gesture," she said, each word measured and sharp. "But it is unnecessary. We already have a set." The air left the room. The words hung there, suspended in the silence. We already have a set. They were not just words. They were a wall. They were a declaration. They meant, we are a separate unit. We have our own traditions. You are not included. I looked at Marcus. His smile had vanished. He looked down at his plate, unable to meet my eyes. He said nothing. He did not defend me. He did not joke it away. He just sat there in the crushing silence and let her words demolish me. My spirit, that hopeful, foolish thing, did not just wilt, it shattered. The carefully constructed fantasy of a perfect family Christmas evaporated, and all that was left was the truth, cold and hard as the china on the table. The matching pajamas were not a symbol of unity. They were a monument to my loneliness. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, a burning shame. I had to get out. I had to get away from that silence. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor like a scream. "I should go," I whispered, though the words sounded like they came from someone else. "I am not feeling very well." I did not look at Chloe. I could not look at Marcus. I simply walked, my legs unsteady, toward the front door. As I fumbled with the latch, my hand trembling, I heard a small voice from the living room. It was Lily. "Grandma," she whispered, "I like the reindeer." And then, cutting through the quiet, came Chloe's voice, not loud but clear and firm, a verdict delivered from the other room. "Do not worry, Lily. Grandma understands." I stepped out into the cold night, the door closing behind me with a quiet, final click. And I understood nothing at all, except that the world had suddenly become a much colder and much lonelier place. The Christmas lights that had seemed so cheerful on the drive over now blinked mockingly in the darkness. I stood there on the perfect porch, alone, realizing that the greatest silence is not the absence of sound, but the absence of a place where you belong. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my bones, that this was only the beginning. The silence that descended after Chloe's pronouncement was heavier than any snowfall. It was a physical presence, smothering the cheerful crackle of the fire, turning the twinkling lights on the tree into a mocking spectacle. I stood there, my empty glass feeling like an anchor in my hand, the ghost of my own son's name hanging in the air between us. Marcus was the first to break, his voice a strained imitation of normalcy. "Well," he said, clapping his hands together with a hollow sound that made me flinch. "Dinner is probably ready. We should not let all this wonderful food go to waste." He moved toward the dining room, a puppet on invisible strings, refusing to meet my eyes. Chloe swept past me, her shoulder deliberately brushing against Amir's, a silent signal that passed between them. She did not look at me either. It was as if I had become invisible, a piece of furniture that had inconveniently been left in the middle of the room. I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome by 28 years of motherhood. I followed them to the table, my feet moving mechanically. The dining room was a picture of festive elegance, exactly as I had imagined it would be when Marcus first told me he had bought this house. The long oak table was set with his grandmother's china, the silverware I had polished for hours gleaming under the soft glow of the crystal chandelier. A centerpiece of pine and red berries stood proudly between silver candlesticks. It was my history, my family's legacy, laid out for a feast where I had no seat. Marcus pulled out a chair for Chloe at one end of the table. He then gestured to a smaller, simpler chair tucked against the wall, a piece clearly brought in from the kitchen. "Mom, you can sit here," he said, his voice tight. It was not a question. It was an instruction. I looked at the head of the table, the place where my husband, God rest his soul, had always sat, and where Marcus had sat the last few Christmases he had hosted. It was empty. Amir was guided to that seat by Chloe's subtle nod. My son, my only child, was yielding his place to another man and exiling his mother to the periphery. I sat down. The chair was lower than the others, and the table edge pressed uncomfortably against my ribs. I felt like a child relegated to the kids' table. The first course was served, a butternut squash soup that tasted like ash in my mouth. The conversation was a stilted, pathetic thing. Marcus attempted to talk about the unseasonably warm weather. Chloe complimented Amir on his choice of wine, a wine I had brought. Amir discussed the stock market. They spoke in a tight, closed circle, their words bouncing between them, leaving me outside the perimeter. I tried to catch Marcus's eye, to send him a silent plea, a signal of my profound hurt. But his gaze was fixed on his bowl, or on Chloe, or on Amir. He was a man desperately trying to appease a god, and I was the sacrificial offering. Chloe, for her part, was the picture of serene defiance. Every so often, I would feel her eyes on me, not with malice, but with a cool, analytical satisfaction, as if she were observing the successful outcome of an experiment. I pushed a piece of roasted carrot around my plate. I remembered teaching Marcus how to use a knife and fork at this very table, in our old, cramped dining room. I remembered his small hands struggling to hold the steak knife, his face scrunched in concentration. Now, he expertly cut his meat, laughing at something Amir said, and the memory was a sharp pain in my chest. I was a ghost at this table, a specter from a past that was being systematically erased. The meal was abbreviated, a mercy. No one had any appetite, least of all me. Chloe was the first to rise. "That was lovely, but I am quite tired," she announced, though she looked more energized than she had all evening. "Amir, would you help me with these plates?" And just like that, I was dismissed. Marcus finally looked at me, his expression a messy canvas of guilt and helplessness. "Mom, we can have coffee in the living room." I shook my head. I could not bear another minute in that room, with its beautiful, hateful tree. "I think I will just go up to bed," I said, my voice sounding thin and far away. I climbed the stairs, each step a monumental effort. The guest room, which had always felt like my room, now felt alien and cold. I changed into my nightgown and slipped into the bed, but sleep was an impossibility. The house was quiet, but the silence was deafening, filled with the echoes of the evening's cruelty. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, the hurt crystallizing into something harder, sharper, a nagging suspicion. It was too deliberate. The matching pajamas, the placement at the table, the way Amir had been seamlessly inserted into a role that should have been mine. It was a campaign, and I had been the only casualty. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the glow of the screen illuminating my face in the dark. My fingers trembled as I opened the social media app. I did not follow Chloe. She had made it clear early on that her online life was for a younger, more curated audience. But her profile was public. I did not have to scroll far. It was the first post, time-stamped earlier that afternoon. The photograph was professionally lit, perfectly composed. There they were, on the same velvet couch where I had been so publicly demoted. Chloe, Marcus, and Amir. They were all wearing the same silk pajamas in a deep burgundy. They were nestled together, Chloe in the middle, beaming, her head tilted toward Amir, while Marcus had his arm around her, smiling a wide, unguarded smile I had not seen in years. They looked perfect, a beautiful, complete unit. My eyes dropped to the caption, and the air left my lungs as if I had been struck. Our little family's perfect Christmas Eve set. So grateful for my two amazing men. New traditions, family is everything, blessed. The words blurred on the screen, our little family. The phrase was a bullet. It was a deliberate, public confirmation of my exclusion. She had planned this. She had taken this photograph hours before I had even arrived, knowing full well what was to come, knowing that this image would be the final, brutal seal on my exile. She had documented her victory and shared it with the world. And Marcus was smiling. He was complicit. He had posed for this, knowing I would see it, or not caring if I did. The pain was so acute it was physical, a cold, sharp ache deep in my bones. But beneath it, a cold fury began to burn. This was not just a slight. This was a betrayal. The night passed in a slow agony of waiting. When the gray light of dawn finally filtered through the window, I rose, my body stiff and tired, but my mind terrifyingly clear. I dressed and went downstairs. The house was still, the aftermath of Christmas morning yet to begin. I found Marcus in the kitchen, alone, fumbling with the coffee machine. He looked up as I entered, and the guilt on his face was so plain it was almost pathetic. "Mom, you're up early," he said, his voice raspy. "I could not sleep," I replied, my tone flat. I did not sit. I stood across the island from him, the cold granite a barrier between us. I saw Chloe's post. He froze, his hand still on the coffee carafe. He did not ask what post. He knew. "Oh," he mumbled. It was just a silly social media thing." "A silly thing?" I repeated, the words dripping with disbelief. "Marcus, the photograph was taken before I even arrived. You were all in matching pajamas. You captioned it, our little family. What part of that is silly?" He would not look at me. "Mom, you are making too much of this. Chloe, she just gets these ideas. She wanted everything to be perfect." "Perfect for whom?" I asked, my voice rising despite my effort to control it. "Perfect for your new family? The one that does not include your mother? You let her do this. You sat there while she gave my Christmas gift to another man. You sat at that table and you said nothing while I was humiliated. And you posed for a picture that tells the whole world I do not belong here." He finally turned, his face a mask of weary frustration. "What was I supposed to do, Mom? Cause a scene? It is her house too. I have to keep the peace." Keep the peace? The words were a whisper, but they carried the weight of my shattered heart. Since when does keeping the peace mean betraying your own mother? Since when does it mean allowing your wife to systematically erase me from your life? I am your family, Marcus. Or I was. "You are being dramatic," he said, and the dismissal in his tone was worse than any insult Chloe could have devised. "It is one Christmas. It is not the end of the world. You just have to adjust. Chloe has a different way of doing things, that is all. You need to try harder to get along with her." There it was, the final, devastating truth. It was not Chloe's cruelty that was the deepest cut. It was his weakness. His utter and complete capitulation. He was not just allowing it, he was justifying it. My feelings, my history, my place in his life were now inconveniences to be managed, problems for me to solve by adjusting. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man I had loved with every fiber of my being. I saw a stranger. A man who would prioritize his wife's whims over his mother's heart, who would call a profound betrayal dramatic, who would ask me to try harder while she wielded exclusion like a weapon. The betrayal was complete. It was not a single act, but a foundation he had willingly helped to build. I felt something shift inside me, a door closing, a lock turning. The love I felt for him did not disappear, but it was suddenly encased in a layer of ice, cold and hard and impermeable. I did not say another word. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the silent house. I walked past the living room where the Christmas tree still stood, a glittering monument to my defeat. I did not look at it. I went straight to the guest room and began to pack my bag with a methodical, numb precision. The tears I had held back all night finally came, but they were silent, cold tears of a grief so profound it had no sound. He had chosen, and in that choice he had lost me. But as I zipped my suitcase closed, a new, terrifying thought began to form in the ruins of my heart. If I was no longer his mother, then what was I? And what was I capable of becoming? The sharp, crystalline cold of Christmas morning bit at my cheeks, but I did not feel it. There was a different kind of cold inside me, a settled, peaceful stillness that had taken root overnight. The storm of tears had passed, leaving in its wake a clear, hard resolution. I stood on the pristine sidewalk, looking at the house. It was a picture-perfect scene from a holiday card. Twinkling white lights outlined the roof and windows, a fresh dusting of snow glittered on the lawn, and a cheerful, plump wreath hung on the dark green door. It was beautiful. It was also a fortress, and I was no longer trying to breach its walls. My hands were buried deep in the pockets of my wool coat. In my right hand, I clutched a small, neatly wrapped box. It was not the elaborate gift I had spent months carefully selecting for Marcus. That gift, a leather-bound journal for the novel he always said he would write, was sitting on my kitchen table at home, a relic of a hope I had finally released. The gift in my pocket was for Amir. A simple, polished stone worry stone I had found at a little shop, smooth and cool to the touch. It was a small thing, a token, a wish for peace for a boy caught in a war he did not start. Taking a deep breath that misted in the frigid air, I walked up the path I had shoveled so many times before. My footsteps were quiet, deliberate. There was no anger in them, no frantic energy. I was a guest arriving at an appointed time, nothing more. I rang the bell. The familiar chime echoed inside, and for a moment there was only the sound of the wind rustling the bare branches of the oak tree in the yard. Then the door swung open and Marcus stood there. He looked exhausted, shadows bruising the skin under his eyes, but he had made an effort. He wore a new red sweater, a gift from Chloe, I was sure. His expression was a tangled knot of relief and apprehension. "Lorraine, you are here." He sounded surprised, as if he had not believed I would come. "I said I would be," I replied, my voice even calm. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The heat of the house wrapped around me, carrying the scents of pine needles and roasting turkey. It was the smell of every Christmas we had ever shared, but now it felt alien, like a perfume I had once loved but had gone strangely sour. The living room was a spectacle of coordinated elegance. The tree was magnificent, towering and perfectly symmetrical, adorned with silver and blue ornaments that matched the throw pillows on the sofa. Chloe sat on the hearth of the fireplace, her legs tucked gracefully beneath her. She was wearing a silk gown the color of champagne. She looked like the star of her own personal holiday special. Amir was on the floor near the tree, carefully examining the tags on a large pile of presents. He offered me a small, hesitant smile, which I returned with a genuine one of my own. "Well, look who decided to join the party," Chloe said, her voice a silken dart. She did not look at me, instead focusing on adjusting the bow on a gift. "We were beginning to think you had better offers." This was it, the moment I had rehearsed in my mind a dozen times. The old Lorraine would have flinched. She would have fired back a defensive retort, or worse, looked to Marcus for defense. But the old Lorraine was gone. I turned to face Chloe, my hands still in my pockets, my posture relaxed. "I understand the boundaries of your little family now, Chloe," I said, and my voice was so quiet, so devoid of malice, that it seemed to suck the noise from the room. "And I will respect them. I will not be an intrusion." Marcus took a half step forward. "Lorraine, you are not an intrusion." I ignored him. My focus was entirely on Chloe, who had finally looked up, her eyes narrowed with a flicker of confusion. I had not fought back. I had agreed with her. I had capitulated, and it had disarmed her completely. I turned away from her, the conversation definitively closed. I walked over to Amir and knelt down, the cold floor seeping through the fabric of my trousers. "Amir," I said softly, "this is for you, a small thing, for when things feel loud." I pressed the small box into his hand. He looked at it, then up at me, his young face serious. "Thank you, Lorraine." "You are very welcome." I wanted to hug him, to whisper that none of this was his fault, but I would not burden him. That was not my place anymore. I stood up and turned to Marcus. The look on his face was one of dawning horror. He was finally seeing it, the change in me. The fight was gone, but so was the hope. He saw the quiet finality in my eyes. I held his gaze for a long moment, pouring every ounce of my sorrow, my love, and my acceptance of our end into that one look. It was not an angry look. It was a goodbye. A heartbreaking, absolute goodbye. "I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I did not wait for a response. I walked back to the front door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the cold. I did not look back. I heard Marcus call my name, a strangled, desperate sound, but I kept walking. The door did not open behind me. He did not follow. The silence that followed my exit was more profound than any slamming door could ever be. Months bled into one another, winter's grip yielding to the tentative thaw of spring. The world outside my apartment window changed, and so did I. The silence that had once been so heavy became a comfortable companion. I filled it with things I had long forgotten I loved. I purchased a large, sprawling fern and learned how not to kill it. I signed up for a pottery class and discovered a deep, meditative joy in the feel of cool, wet clay spinning between my hands. I reconnected with old friends, women who had watched me fade into Marcus's world and were now delighted to have me back. My life was smaller, yes, but it was mine. The sharp, aching grief for the future I had lost had softened into a quiet acknowledgement. I was building a new life, brick by solitary brick, and there was a fierce, joyful strength in its foundation. I was learning, for the first time in a very long time, how to be my own company. One evening in late spring, I was walking home from the library, a stack of books heavy in my tote bag. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming lilacs. My route took me past the park, and on a whim, I cut through it. The setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the grass, and that was when I saw him. Marcus was sitting alone on a bench, still in his work clothes. He was not reading. He was not on his phone. He was just sitting, staring at the duck pond with a hollowed-out expression I recognized all too well. He looked older. The handsome lines of his face seemed deeper, etched with a permanent weariness. He was a man living in a beautiful home, with a beautiful wife and a stepson he adored, yet he sat on a park bench alone, looking utterly lost. He was living the life he had chosen, the life he had allowed Chloe to architect, and it was clearly a gilded cage. I stopped walking, shielded by the broad trunk of an oak tree. My heart did not pound with longing or anger. It ached with a profound, quiet pity. He had gotten everything he thought he wanted, and it had cost him everything that had ever truly mattered. I stood there for a full minute, watching the man I had loved for half my life. He finally stirred, pulling his phone from his pocket. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the winter air on Christmas morning, that he was looking at my name. He was wondering if he could call, if there was any path back, any fragment of the past left to salvage. He did not make the call. He simply slumped forward, elbows on his knees, and dropped his head into his hands. The gesture was one of utter defeat. I turned away from the scene, a bittersweet sadness settling over me. I continued my walk home, toward my quiet apartment, my books, my life. But as I walked, a single, unsettling thought echoed in the newfound peace of my mind. His inaction had broken us, and now, his inaction was slowly destroying him. And the truly terrifying part was the question that lingered, a ghost at the edge of my contentment. If he ever did find the strength to act, what would I even say?